Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February meeting of Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'm Councillor Josh Blacker, chair of the meeting. Obviously, we have various members here. This evening, we're also joined by Councillor Bassam Mahfouz, who's the Cabinet Member for Finance. We also have Ross Brown and Shabana Kalza just as officers to speak to the budget item. As always, please, members, do leave your videos on so that I can see what's going on as chair of the meeting. Please keep yourselves muted though, because obviously you will be picked up and put on live if there are sounds happening in the background. If you do wish to speak, please use the hands up function on the participants tab or wherever it is on your version of Zoom, and I'll be using that to manage how we speak tonight. And remember, we are of course live on YouTube, so anything that happens in your backgrounds will be seen and broadcast to obviously the entire borough of Ealing and beyond. So with that said, I think we can move on to the agenda. We have quite a tight one tonight, which is quite rare for us. Number one, I don't have any apologies for absence, which is good. I think we are still waiting for a couple of people to join us, but I'm sure they will do very shortly. There are no declarations of interest that I'm aware of tonight. So other than the fact that we all live in Ealing and obviously the budget affects us all, especially the council tax item, are there any specific declarations of interest people want to raise? No? Excellent. There are no matters to be considered in private, which takes us on to the minutes of the 7th of January meeting. Did anyone have any comments on those minutes for accuracy? I am seeing shaking heads. Councillor Burke, I think your point will be your apologies for absence, which are noted in the current version. So that has been amended for you. Okay, so can I take those minutes as agreed then? Fab. And I again, given your faces aren't being broadcast, I can see various nods and no one is saying no. So we will take those as read, which takes us to item 6. The 2021-22 budget strategy, and we have, as I said, Councillor Mahfouz, supported by Ross Brown and Shabana Kalza, to present the budget. So I think Councillor Mahfouz, if you want to introduce, and then Ross has a presentation for us. Obviously, we do have the cabinet papers, have the full budget papers. Oh, excellent! There we go. Look, the cabinet papers have the full budget papers to refer to. There were some headlines printed with our own agenda, which were very helpful. But Councillor Mahfouz, I'll hand over to you to take us through.
Good evening, Councillor Josh Blacker and colleagues. Obviously you've got my name there and portfolio holder for finance. I think we all know each other very well, but great to be here for the Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting for February, which looks at obviously solely the budget proposals that we have coming to Cabinet next week, and then subsequently, hopefully, to full council in early March for consideration by all members. So if we can move on to the next slide. What I wanted to talk through before handing over to our Chief Financial Officer, Ross Brown, was to go through some of the key messages of this budget. So first and foremost is that it's set against the backdrop, as many of you will be aware, of over the past 10 years, central government austerity in terms of funding to local authorities has meant, in Ealing's case, 64p for every £1 we used to receive in 2010 has now been removed. So we now receive only 36p for every pound that we used to receive back in 2010. But furthermore, this year, I guess, is that there has been a promise of repaying all of our costs in terms of COVID, which has not been fully fulfilled, and there continues to be underfunding for local authorities. And as I say, in terms of COVID repayment, having had the promise at the start of the pandemic that everything would be fully paid, we've had to wait time and time again to find out exactly what the totality of that actually looks like in reality. And that uncertainty, as for us, as it has been for many businesses up and down the borough, has caused great difficulty and concern in terms of trying to manage our finances. So The second point is around the government 5% council tax levy. The third is about prioritising and protecting the most vulnerable. And the fourth is that this is a budget of investment. I'm going to go through some of these key messages in a bit more detail. So I've already gone through the first one in a bit more detail already. Just a graph to show. This is a graph that's taken from the presentation that we gave to residents, businesses and community and voluntary sector organisations back in December as part of our engagement with them and the public around our budget setting process. If we move on to the next slide, please. We'll come on to that second point in terms of the 5% council tax levy, or to be fully accurate, 4.99%. So we can see there headlines from the Express and the Mirror back in late last year, where they had picked up the fact that actually Rishi Sunak at the comprehensive spending review that he carried out last year was very, very clear that if the funding that he announced stated was going to local authorities, more than half of that was made up of local authorities up and down the country, increasing both the council tax levy and the social care precept by the maximum amount in order to ensure that funding came through to support local services. So it's very clear bipartisan agreement in terms of that being a levy straight from the Chancellor to local residents up and down the borough. If we move on to the next slide. As I said, we engaged with a number of engagement sessions, and thank you to colleagues who came along to one or more of those. And as part of that, we asked local residents, business owners and community and voluntary sector organisations and representatives what they wanted to see as our top priority in terms of setting this budget. And what came out time and time again was that they said that they wanted us to protect the most vulnerable. And I can say that the budget that we have before us this evening that I'm proposing has listened to the community, and we've acted. The budget delivers on protecting and prioritising the most vulnerable. We introduced at the start of this lockdown last year a progressive council tax reduction scheme, which has been extended, of course, for another year. And actually what that has how has that reflected is that progressive system to support people with their council tax liabilities has actually seen a huge surge of uptake amongst working age claimants over the past year, sadly because of the economic fallout of COVID-19. We will also see going forward that this council tax reduction scheme will be expanded to include care leavers. And there, in addition to that, I'll come on to it in a bit more detail on my next slide, significant investment for children's services, so our most vulnerable residents across the borough. And I'm delighted to say that all the savings that we have tabled within the set of proposals come from our future Ealing proposals and don't have an adverse impact on the most vulnerable residents in our borough. So finally, in terms of that fourth plinth of the key messages for this budget is that budget of investment. So as I touched upon just before, the children's services area will see an investment of £9 million. We've also agreed separate to this, but very much part and parcel of this budget, is that £400 million in order to deliver on our bold plans to deliver 2,500 genuinely affordable homes. Of course, that money is in relation to delivering some of those numbers through Broadway Living, our council-owned company. And then we've got a further £5.1 million for road and pathway improvements, around £500,000 for rolling out additional doorstep food waste recycling, which is the one key area that could help us continue to increase our recycling. Around £750,000 into disabled facilities grants, and again another further £500,000 for when we do come out of this lockdown and we need to get people moving again and getting people active in terms of our leisure facility equipment. So, Councillor Backer, at this point, I'll hand over to. One last slide from me is just in terms of before the pandemic happened, we were actually hoping that it would be a position where we didn't have to talk about putting forward savings, that we could talk about even more significant growth items, that I'd be tabling for next financial year. Sadly, of course, COVID-19 put a blocker on that. But actually, throughout in the run-up to that, and what has delivered for us this evening again, is that our future reading programme continues to deliver better outcomes, as it has done with our SEND review, so our special educational needs reviews, our Better Lives programme, community managed libraries, which actually managed to get into one on one of the 2 days that it was open, and Councillor Driscoll there was volunteering as well. So fantastic to see local councillors doing their bit on that as well. And of course, as I mentioned, delivering on the genuinely affordable homes target through our Broadway Living business plan as well. And of course, at the start of the year, or in July, we saw the move to greener Ealing in terms of our environmental services contract, which has seen significant improvements for staff salaries, benefits, and obviously in terms of the service that we see on the ground as well. We've also moved digitally, and clearly, as with a number of other organisations, moved to a completely new way of working overnight. But actually, we were really well equipped to be able to do that, given the tools that we've given staff beforehand. But that's enough from me for this point. I'll hand over to Ross Brown to carry on with the rest of the slides.
Before Ross comes in, I do have Councillor Rooney with a question, if that's right. So just Councillor Rooney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Bassam. It's just a quick question about your first slide. You mentioned about support for care leavers. So I just have a question on that. Will it come up a bit later, or should I was just wondering what support was being offered to care leavers, but I can ask it later if that'd be more convenient.
Sure, probably best if we can wrap it up in the questions at the end, but I'll make a note of it now so we make sure that we cover that. Sarah? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great. Ross, did you want to take us through then?
Will do, Chair, and good evening, members. So yeah, I'm going to step you through in quite a lot of detail all the really important components of both the requirement for our balanced budget from a 2021 perspective, and more broadly the medium-term financial strategy, which of course covers a whole host of important and related statutory requirements, including a number of strategies. So I've got slides that talk to them, hopefully pitched at the right level. So I'll do a little bit of introduction first, then an overview, and then we'll go into the individual key sections of the overall Cabinet report, which, as Councillor Mafusa said, will therefore flow through as a recommendation to full council on the 2nd of March, basically Budget Council. So, as you're hopefully all aware, the budget report is our statutory requirement to set a balanced budget for the forthcoming year, which means, in effect, we have to have sufficient resources to match with the known expenditure profile for the forthcoming 12 months, be it 21, 22. We call that a sustainable annual budget because we're also interested as much in the immediacy as we are in the medium term, and providing that stable financial platform for the delivery of vital services to the residents of Ealing. The budget strategy, as it says here, it has a combination of new savings that come forward in part of delivering our balanced budget. Clearly, we take our latest income position, our latest expenditure obligations, and usually, as it has been for many years now, we find ourselves in a position of needing to make savings to set that balanced budget going forward. So that's what this report does. It also, of course, seeks specific approval for amendments to the revenue and capital programme overall. As it says there, 2nd of March is the formal date which that will be approved. And clearly it covers off a whole host of specific information. And therefore what flows off the back of this is then the issuance of bills, both from a council tax and typically from a business rates perspective. Although there's a slight nuance this year in relation to business rate bills being issued. Next slide, please. So this is a bullet point overview of what we are seeking approval from members from. So it's savings, the balanced budget, the projection around the MTFS, which I'll come on to talk about as we come to that slide, which is increasingly challenging to do given the relatively high level of uncertainty around income assumptions, and particularly in the context of the current pandemic. it requires me to express my view as the Council's Section 151 officer on the adequacy overall of the total level of reserves that we hold, and specifically the general fund balance, which is meant to be an appropriate level set by myself, recommended to members to allow us to manage unforeseen pressures that arise within a financial year. And as we're all aware, there's been plenty of those in this financial year. We also have a number of very important strategies. They are quite lengthy. They are typically defined from a SIPFA point of view that we have to have these, so we'll touch on those briefly. One of the key ones that really links the capital strategy, which sets out our overall investment aspirations, to the revenue budget, is the Treasury management strategy. Members, of course, are very familiar with this because you approve it on an annual basis, and members also approved a fairly significant variation to that quite recently as we incepted the Broadway Living funding facility into the Council's programme midway throughout the year. So you'll remember those key changes that came to full Council more recently on that. It also covers off updates with regard to schools and the housing revenue account. The housing revenue account sits in a separate report for approval. And as it says there at the bottom, we do seek the specific approval for the individual proposals that we're bringing forward. So quite a lot to it, there's no doubt you'll have seen, both in terms of the length of the Cabinet report itself and also the number of appendices, which unfortunately we do have to bring to you, and are very important that we do that for that transparency and probity that members bring to them. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So first of all, on the investment side, there are in total a combination of investments being proposed as part of these papers. Councillor Mahfouz has already touched on the composition of the £7 million of investment into predominantly our asset side, although clearly that's got a very strong read across to the revenue and service operational side. And that makes up 7 of the £22 million. In addition to that, Councillor Mahfouz has also referenced the fact that there's circa £9 million of new funding going in to address some of those challenges that we face from a children's services perspective for quite some time now, that we've not been fully successful in controlling from a future Ealing perspective. But that's mainly around demographic changes and rises that have arisen due to the different pressures that we're experiencing going through. And what we've tried to do is, within that £15 million, or 14.8 million to be exact, we've split that down to give you a flavour of the different types of areas where that service budget will be allocated. So just by way of clarity, the new service of £1.875 million, the large majority of that is made up in terms of the additional funding from a Greener Ealing, our in-house waste services subsidiary. You'll recall that when we incepted that service delivery model into the budget from a 2021 perspective, it was based on a 9/12 of the year proportion. This is in effect the remaining 3/12 of that financial year growth that we originally announced as part of that budget process, but which falls in the 21-22 financial year. So outside of that, you'll see there's a large pressure from a demographic and inflationary perspective, which together totals just in excess of £10 million of the circa 14.8 million. Of course, we've received new grants, we've lost some grants, so we also have to take account of those grants that are directly used for service provision purposes in terms of balancing our net budget. That's circa £1 million. We've also got some income that we think will be adversely affected, which we will not be able to receive going forward. We have, of course, had an extension to the government's sales fees and charges compensation mechanism, which looks to recompense us for a proportion in the pound after a certain disregard is allowed. And that, of course, will provide a bit more certainty than we would otherwise have been facing in next financial year. But even notwithstanding that, there's still some pressures that we feel need to be covered off from a service income shortcoming perspective. And then there are a few savings, albeit quite small, that are not achievable in next financial year, that were hard built into the MTFS overall, which we've tried to transparently account for here. So we've got an overall investment, £22 million, split broadly, £7 million capital, £15 million revenue. As Councillor Baffouz quite rightly says, that the most significant investment, quite rightly, the council's ever made is in its delivery or aspiration to deliver those genuinely affordable homes, which was £400 million in the financial year. So that needs to be seen in the context of these capital investment proposals as well. What I've tried to do, just by way of context, is link what I'm talking to the relevant sections in the report, which is quite difficult to do. So that's what those references to the sections, the appendices, and the recommendations do. So hopefully that will give you a bit of a key in terms of trying to follow that through. Chair, do you want me to stop at the end of this section here? We do talk a little bit further down in the presentation in a bit more detail about those investments from a capital perspective, but I can try and pause at the appropriate point to take questions then, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any hands up at the moment. So Councillor Shaw has obviously heard me say that and has put his hand up. So Councillor Shaw, do you want to ask something on this? And then I think most of them then will be covered later.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just going through that briefly. Thanks, Ross. I just noticed the greener ealing, the greener ealing part of the capital growth and an investment that you raised. You know, I've been in a lot of these meetings, and you spoke about the 9/12ths previously being announced and 3/12ths now being added on, and that's where this figure's coming from. And I just wondered where and when we'd had this discussion, because I can't remember it. Maybe I missed it in the meetings previously, but you know, could you just sort of let us know that?
Yeah, of course, Councillor Shaw. I can't remember the date specifically, unfortunately. It was the Cabinet report where we took the decision to bring our waste services back in-house, which will have been prior to the commencement of the 2021 financial year. There'll have been the Cabinet report that set out the business case, although of course it actually went through a number of series of decisions on the lead up to council approving that report before they took the final decision. But I think it'll have been in the early part of the 2020 calendar year, but I can of course find that, or perhaps Shibali can find that behind the scenes as I continue to talk, and we'll reference it later.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I do remember the business case coming and us discussing the business case at OSC in quite detail, even involving paper clips at one point. You know, so, but I just don't recall that. That's all. So thanks for clarifying.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ross. Do you want to carry on then? And Councillor Shaw, if you could take your hand down so I don't get confused, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And that goes for everyone else as well. If people can take their hands down after speaking as well, that will save me from confusion. Thanks. Ross.
Thank you. So the next sections are savings, again referenced at the top, and the specific recommendations to which these savings relate. In total, there's just over £11 million of savings being put forward from a 21-22 perspective. Now, that £11.3 million does contain something that's a little bit unusual. It contains a number of cost avoidance savings or cost containment savings, and the majority of those relate to the children's services area. So we'll talk about those in a second. In terms of traditional base budget savings, i.e. things that need to be adjusted from the base budget to allow for a balanced budget to be set, that resource versus expenditure requirement, we've got £7 million as set out in Appendix 2 in a reasonable amount of detail that make up that £7 million. We're also quite rightly referencing the savings that relate to the housing revenue account, just this looks at the totality of budgets, not just the revenue account itself. We've got a number of digital program savings, and these are savings that relate to the previous decision around the digital program to invest in new ways of working and a new digital channel effectively. And these are the savings that are effectively repaying that initial investment that was incepted into the capital programme a number of years ago. And then finally, we've got those cost avoidance savings, which are predominantly the approach that we're taking with children's services to look to reduce a number of in-year costs that they've experienced, and have actually been quite successful in doing so this year. That when combined with the growth that we referenced on the previous slide, that's circa £9 million, will leave them in a balanced budget position for next year. So what we're not doing is we're not asking them to take further base budget out of children's services. We are allocating circa £9 million of new growth to them, but we've got an in-year containment target to make sure that we manage existing pressures to the value of £3.5 million. So they aren't effectively budget reductions, they're cost containment proposals. And when taken together, they equate to £11.3 million. Now, you may have looked at this in a 22-23 perspective and said, well, why have we got a big credit figure on the general fund savings line in the following financial year? And the reason for that is that a large proportion of the savings that we put forward in this financial year have a single year effect, as opposed to are going to be built into the base budget on a recurring basis. And therefore we can legitimately put forward £7 million of savings for this financial year where our balanced budget requirement sits. But of course, we have to then reverse them out where those savings are not recurring by their nature, which is what that 4.5 million represents to the right hand side. No doubt you'll have looked through the individual schedule itself, which sets out the relevant savings. You'll see in there that we've split them between the different types of outcome reviews and across the different future yielding outcome themes, such as residents, healthy, active and independent versus modern council efficiency, modern council income and debt, and a number of other different headers. So that there's much more detail contained, each with their own individual FE1, which is basically a set of forms that we require to do that clearly sets out exactly how those savings will be achieved. And we clearly included a narrative for each of those individual savings, albeit at a summary level, that gives members a flavour and an insight as to what each of those savings means in practice. I'm going to pause there for a second, Chair.
I don't think there are any questions at this point. I imagine we all. Oh, Councillor Rice. There's always one.
Sorry,
I always speak too soon. Miriam.
Yes, so yeah, thank you about that, Ross. So I was looking through the grid of the savings at risk, and there was one thing that stood out to me. So I'm presuming this is a good point to ask about that at this point in the meeting. Is about the removal of the housing quota for care leavers to reduce numbers being placed in semi-independent accommodation. So I'm just wondering about what that really refers to, and why this is really in my mind is because we had a scrutiny meeting last night where we were talking about the issue of care leavers being properly accommodated. So I'm just wondering what this refers to, how it really works. Does it mean that we might end up incurring greater costs elsewhere, having to look after young people who aren't going to be in proper accommodation after leaving care? I mean, I don't know if it really would count as a recommendation, but one thing we talked about last night was the private accommodation which gets set up, where there are rooms where the young people or people, they can have a room which is got basic facilities, and then they have a number of communal facilities, and they're actually really quite nice places and good places to be. So just an idea, if we are having issues looking after our care leavers, maybe it's something we could investigate the next time that we give planning permission to one of these developments, if they could perhaps reserve a few rooms for our care leavers. That just might be an idea in order to help us get around this, but I don't know what might really work in the future if this is an issue that we've got at the moment. Please, thank you.
Before you come back on that, let's take Councillor Ball's question as well, and then you can answer those, and then we can move on to the next slide. So, John.
Yeah, that's right. Just a couple of the actually very small amounts really on the savings that I wanted to ask about. So one of them is there's a point on printer contracts in Percival House, which reminded me of something that came up at the General Purposes Committee the other day about photocopier contracts at the Town Hall, which still seem to be significant amounts. Have they been looked at? Because considering that there's very few people left in the Town Hall, I think that there may be savings to be made there. And the other one was, the other one was FE12132, the rationalised local neighbourhood recycling centres. There have already been quite a lot of those local centres removed. Does this, does this involve removing more centres? And if so, is there a risk that would encourage fly tipping?
Ross, do you want to take those then? So the care lever and John's points.
Yeah, sure. So Councillor Rice's question about care levers and risk, that remains a challenge for us to place care levers in the right types of accommodation. Clearly, the supply side of that is where one of the biggest challenges sits for us. We do recognise there's a competing demand for the right types of accommodation across the borough. Sometimes those care levers also compete for the type of accommodation that temporary accommodation clients require as well. And we do look at that holistically, and we've actually done a lot of work over the course of the last year to try and get better at prioritisation and allocation of housings for the right type. I do think that one of the benefits of Broadway Living, our registered provider at one of our subsidiaries, is that will allow a new quantum of genuinely affordable homes to be brought onto the market that will hopefully look to significantly shift the supply side within the borough. Now, there's always probably going to be a higher demand of houses in the borough generally, because it's such a nice place to live. Generally, so that will be a challenge for us, but definitely our genuinely affordable homes will hopefully be able to target some of those individuals more at need than others through the right allocations policy to address that. And that, of course, as you say, is seen in the round across the different sorts of private rented sector accommodation that's provided, but that does remain a risk for us within this current financial year, and will roll forward to next financial year until we have that provision up and running effectively. Councillor Ball, on the printer contracts, the savings relate to the estate as an entirety, although I think specifically the savings figure that's contained in the appendix is predominantly aimed at Percival House reduction of estate. As you may be aware, we're in a number of fixed year agreements, so it's for the reduction of a proportion of the provision. I'm not aware immediately that does include the Ealing Town Hall printer usage as well, but of course I'll look into that and come back to you if I've misquoted that. Thank you.
I was just going to add to the first about the care levers. I thought should really come in and answer Sarah's question from earlier on that one. So in effect, the position for care levers as of April will be that any of those Ealing care levers aged 18 to 25 will be liable to zero council tax. So they will not pay any council tax up until the end of the financial year after their 25th birthday. So yeah, if they've got a birthday in April, then they'll get the whole 4 years benefit of that beyond that point, but zero council tax liability, so long as obviously they are the person named on the council tax for that particular property, and they were residing at an Ealing address previously as one of our in-care young people. So on the point that John raised around the household, the neighbourhood recycling centres, as you'll know, as a local councillor for many years, a number of these are hot fly tipping hotspots already. So actually in fact they actually attract fly tips by existing in the first place. So we'll be looking to remove those, because actually with the expansion of our doorstep recycling offer, that's really pretty comprehensive now. And as I've said, with the further investment of food waste recycling, which obviously can't be done from neighbourhood recycling centres anyway, One thing that will be retained at those sites is, you'll appreciate there are some of them that belong to charities to collect food. Oh, sorry, not collect food, sorry, mixing up with clothes. So to collect clothes. Those are actually incredibly valuable for those charities, and we will absolutely be retaining those ones. So those charities will be able to keep those collection banks at those sites and retain that source of income for themselves.
Can I just come back on that, please, Chair?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that, I mean, yes, the offering is getting better, but there still are quite a lot of people in, you know, flats above shops and that sort of accommodation that aren't in any of the recycling schemes. So the only recycling they can do is the neighbourhood centres. So
we have expanded the recycling offer pretty intensely. So it's, yeah, if you can give us the details of any of these flats above shops which they're struggling to do any recycling. There's the bag scheme, you know, the clear bag schemes for almost every. I don't know any flats above shops that don't have access to that particular recycling offer, for example. But if you know them, please do send them through, and we'll make sure that the team get onto that. In fact, the only location where there tends to be no recycling facilities is where we've tried immensely hard with the landlord to allow us to put recycling collection facilities on site, and it's in fact the landlord of that particular private estate, where they've prevented us from doing so.
Thanks. Ross, do you want to move on then?
Yeah, next slide, please, Shabana. Thanks. So what this does very briefly is it gives you the summary level, which takes the budget gap from where it was when we last reported that back in December 2020, which was clearly pre-provisional settlement from the Chancellor. It feeds in all the work we've been doing from a future wheeling perspective that looks to close the revenue gap, which is that £7 million that we've just looked at in a bit of detail. It updates for the further grants that we've received as a result of that announcement. It takes into account some further COVID-specific funding that's been allocated on a single year basis, and it updates the income and council tax assumptions. And of course, that 10.5 million is the single largest figure in closing that budget gap, and that does contain my office a recommendation for a 1.99% increase in council tax and a 3% increase in social care presets, and that equates to around 7.2 million of that 10.593 million. And when you apply those 4 different factors in total, that shuts the budget gap and allows us to propose a balanced budget for 21-22 financial year.
Thanks. Any questions then on this kind of general budget gap slide? Checking my list. I don't think there are on this. Do we come back to council tax, Ross?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on, and then we'll come. I'm sure there'll be questions on council tax when we come to that, because I know that's one of the key things that will affect everyone in the borough.
It does, yeah. Okay, so I'll touch on this briefly, and that's because it's should be taken in the context of the uncertainty in which we face. We have to project forward what the budget gaps looks like in future years. You know that there's a huge amount of uncertainty, both from an operating environment perspective, whether it be COVID-19 or exiting the EU, or just a general change in demand that we're seeing at the moment. That makes it quite hard for us financially to predict accurately what that budget gap looks like for future years. That's compounded, of course, by the fact we've only got a single year certainty and a lot of grants that have been provided in this financial year, this being 21-22, that are not baked into the core spending power. They are one-off grants, so a number of them we think will reverse in future years. And the combination of those factors, but predominantly that uncertainty around income perspective, is what's driving the majority of that gap from a future years perspective. So I won't spend a huge amount of time on that. I'm conscious of it being 20-8 already. That's just a bit of a feel for what the budget gap will probably look like going forward. We will, of course, update that through the 3 in-year budget strategy reports that we bring through before therefore setting the 22-23 budget. So there'll be a significant number of movements in that space going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, let's press on.
Yeah, so the next one is around my view, my statutory view that I have to express as CFO, or technically the Section 151 officer, about the robustness and the overall adequacy of reserves and estimates that we've got. I'm satisfied with the budget that's being proposed is deliverable within the context of the overall service pressures that we experience on a regular basis, which is very much part of local authority service delivery in a restrained resource environment. The overall budget does look to make a small contribution as part of continuing to ensure we have the right overall reserves resilience in this financial year of £3.5 million. And importantly, it also requires me to set a general fund balance, which I've deemed to be appropriate at the existing levels of £15.9 million. Now, clearly that's taken in the context of the overall challenges that we face. We do know that we've seen, albeit quite delayed, a significant proportion of funding come through from central government to meet the majority of the needs that we've incurred from a COVID perspective. We do still have a cash gap on that, just to be clear. There's still about a £7 million gap in cash terms, which were reported as part of our budget update Q3 report going through to Cabinet on the same agenda. But in the context of the appropriateness of the general fund balance, I'm happy that that figure of just under £16 million, which is consistent with previous years, given the reserves resilience that we've got and the retention of a proportion of the one-off grant that came through for a COVID-19 perspective for 21-22, is sufficient for us to operate sustainably within next year. That is, of course, not to say that there won't be significant pressures that might arise next year, but from a budget setting perspective, I'm comfortable that that's an appropriate level for the council to operate with.
Thanks.
Now, just to say, of course,
sorry, I was going to say, finish what you were going to say, and then we'll go to Councillor Ball's question.
I was just going to say that is, of course, on the context that the officer recommendation contained in the Cabinet report to increase council tax and social care precept is taken, because that alone is worth around £7.2 million of income from the council's perspective. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Ball.
Yeah, it's sort of slightly devil's advocate question, but with all the uncertainty that's going on about, you know, where we will end up post-COVID, isn't there a case for saying that the reserves ought to be higher than they have been historically, because we're in more uncertain times?
Thanks. And then Councillor Shaw would like to come in as well. And then if you take those two, Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think this is probably the appropriate time to raise the council tax issue, really. I mean, obviously, it's a significant amount of the savings is actually passing this cost directly on to residents in the borough. You know, in Band D, this effectively equates to about £57 a month that residents are going to have to find on their council tax bill. And again, you know, given, as Councillor Ball rightly says, that people are going to be stretched in the next financial year, you know, there are questions about how we will collect it all. We have very good collection rates, I know, but, you know, this is going to be an unprecedented year with people finding hardships. And so I'm just sort of wondered, Ross, if you know, how reassured you are that we won't actually be putting people into more difficulties, and that a lot of these payments won't actually materialise.
Thanks. So Ross, should we not be increasing our reserves, and then, you know, what's the impact of the council tax going to be? And I imagine Councillor Mafuz, you might want to say something on that as well.
Yeah, so just to take Councillor Ball's question in the context of the general uncertainty, I think you have to look at that in a balanced way, as ever. We're reasonably confident around what the business as usual costs will be. from a future year's perspective. And of course, we are significantly investing from a service perspective in the day-to-day revenue to make sure those budgets are in a sustainable position. You could take the approach that in a higher climate of uncertainty, you want to have more financial resilience to deal with that, which is a very sensible suggestion to do. I think that taken in the round, when we look at the totality of overall general fund reserves, which we could deploy in circumstances where we need to, that provides us with a reasonable level of resilience in the current climate. In addition to that, we have the separate £15.9 million of general fund balance, and we are also retaining a proportion of the one-off grant that came through from central government for 2021-22 in relation to COVID-19, and we will retain that to deploy in year. And the fourth point, which just comes back to what I said before, is that we have seen where we've genuinely had to incur expenditure, albeit with a significant delay from a timing perspective. The government, in many instances, has actually provided that level of support over and above. Now, I think that I need to caveat that next year, to be honest with you, Councillor Board, because they have forward funded a proportion of COVID grant already, which we've already applied, although we are retaining some of that. If we were to increase reserves further, that would mean that we would have to either find further financial savings or make cuts elsewhere to sustain that. In relation to Councillor Shaw's question, we do have a more detailed slide down on slide 24, I think, that actually covers off the individual impact across all the respective bands on council tax. What I would say is that we absolutely recognise, and I recognise as a professional officer, the burden that people are under from a personal finance perspective. I also recognise the obligation that I have to ensure that the council has sufficient budget provision to provide for those vital services that we do across the borough. I also think it's worth seeing the council tax increases in the context of the very progressive and supportive council tax reduction scheme that we have in place. Councillor Mafouz quite rightly referenced that we've seen a significant increase in working age claimants throughout this financial year, and that's actually increased from around 14,300 up to 17,400. What that means is that effective council tax income loss from one perspective is a cost that the council is bearing as a result of providing that support to those individuals that are financially vulnerable or financially in need, and therefore they will be protected to a significant extent, if not in its entirety, depending upon their benefit level, from any increases that we put forward from a council tax and a social care precept perspective. Councillor Shaw's very sensible challenge around collection rates going forward is something we've been wrestling with throughout the financial year. We've seen significant reductions in terms of council tax income that's been collected. We obviously made the very sensible decision to provide delay in payments where people are experiencing financial hardship from a council tax perspective and were not entitled to council tax reduction or council tax support. And we do have lower income collected than previous years. That's all wrapped up in our collection fund and form part of the budget estimates overall that you see today. So we are hopeful that we will continue to collect reasonable amounts of income and proportionate to those people that don't find themselves in the CTR support. But obviously we do look at that very carefully, and we also have, as you know, very sensible and proportionate income recovery options in terms of how we engage with residents to encourage them to pay, and we do offer flexible payment terms where they're not able to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Baz, did you want to add something before I ask Joanna Dabrowska to ask her question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, because I think Ross has covered it all comprehensively. But I think the other element, I think, is that clearly, you know, we don't want to be increasing council tax, but the government made it incredibly clear. So Rishi Sunak, in that comprehensive spending review back in November last year, announced a sum of money which he claimed was for local councils. But well over half of that fund was made up purely of this proposed maximum council tax and social care precept levy increase of just shy of 5%. Now, we also know that council tax, the way it's been designed, is a regressive taxation, because actually it doesn't tax you on the basis of your ability to pay, but just purely on the value of the property that you're residing in, or your value of your property back in 1990 or 91. So the introduction of the council tax reduction scheme and making sure that it was progressive in the way that it was set out back in April last year is incredibly important in terms of being that huge counterbalance for that regressive taxation. Obviously, Ross has talked through the numbers of people signing up, so we've seen significant uptake of working age people signing up to it. But I think the other element to point out, just to remind people about the council tax reduction scheme, is that it's based on your income, and it's actually based on your genuine income. So if your only income is through benefits, we completely disregard that, and that's not taken into account at all when we consider the level of council tax reduction that an individual or family are entitled to. So it's an incredibly progressive counterweight to the challenge that we have with council tax increases, as we've been effectively forced to do this time round.
Thanks. Councillor Shaw, I'm going to assume your hand is still up from your last question. So I'll go to Councillor Dabrowska, and if Gareth, your hand's still up, we'll come back to you for a follow-up. Joanna.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a question for Officer Ross. Over the years, I've been hearing from the Housing Department and the Benefits Budgeting Department, which helps residents who have hardship, that the discretionary hardship fund is always underspent, and there's always money. Basically, the council wants to help people, just people don't necessarily apply for this discretionary fund. So over the years, a lot of money has been sort of loosely put unspent or unprovided for. So over the years, I would like to know how much money has not been, how much of the hardship budget has not been given out, and can't we use that for any hardship this year and the next year or so as we get out of COVID and as the economy gets back on its feet?
Ross, in terms of historic figures, maybe provide those separately, because I think probably won't have them to hand. And I don't know if you want to say anything about just carrying forward underspends and how we do that generally.
Where we have a council funded revenue budget that's underspent, that's either taken in the context of settling up the budget overall in an individual year, or where it's appropriate to ring fence that sometimes is ring fence sat in a reserve and then used to fund a pressure. I'm pretty sure the DHP mechanism was done on a reclaim basis, kind of a use it or lose it from a funded perspective. But I will check on that and come back to Councillor Dabrowska as part of the historic analysis too.
Please, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall we move on?
Yeah. A bit of a dry one this. Treasury management strategy, as I say, is quite a complex and lengthy document. It's effectively the tie between the council's capital investment and its associated revenue budgets. To be brief, there are no fundamental changes in terms of the regulations or requirements of the Treasury management strategy contained from what members are seeing as part of the Budget Council forthcoming. There are, of course, some changes to the individual prudential indicators, which are the calculated numbers which vary based on the level of debt and the level of capital ambition we have, and particularly the capital ambition funded by prudential borrowing. But of course, what you've seen today is relatively minor, and particularly in the context of that significant investment the council's most recently made in terms of providing the overall funding facility for Broadway Living registered provider. So if that's okay, Chair, I won't delve into any more detail on that unless councillors have any questions, which I guess I can delve into that.
At the risk of what always happening, I shall say there's no one with their hands up at the moment. So move on before anyone does, I think.
Okay, thanks. Capital strategies are a little bit similar. This is about the overall framework and allocation for management of capital resources as a whole. It forms that kind of three-way look between the revenue, between the Treasury management and in itself the capital budgets available. It sets out the framework for investment alongside the Treasury management technical aspect of that, and really gives that rounded approach across the budget strategy, which is predominantly revenue-led, as you know, the Treasury management strategy and the capital strategy. And of course, just to be clear, is one of the specific recommendations that council officers need from a member perspective as part of full council. I'm suspecting there might not be too many questions on this one as well, so if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a more detailed recap of what Councillor Foos touched on at the start of the presentation, specifically in relation to capital flowing from that capital strategy that I just touched on. So these are the net additions to the overall council's capital scheme. And just by way of context, the council's capital scheme, following that really material investment in genuinely affordable housing, now actually stands at over £1 billion over this 5-year period. So a really significant economic influence, and also a really significant influencer of service delivery and need within the borough. So in the context of that, relatively small, but relatively small proportionate, sensibly, because the majority of these, such as that investments in highways, footways and carriageways, do come with a direct revenue implication, just those are the schemes that are funded via prudential borrowing, and of course they carry that revenue cost to us. So this is just presented to you. It's an extract of Appendix 6 in effect, which I'm sure you've read already, but it's just from a transparency purpose showing all the specific amendments that we've made.
Thanks, Russ. I think in the absence of anyone else, I think you mentioned, that significant £1 billion investment in the economy. Like, how much of that goes locally? How much of that investment ends up in the local economy versus, some kind of contractor based elsewhere? How much of it, goes employing local people? And, because I know we have the social value policy in our potential in our contracts. How much of that does get directed within the borough to support jobs and growth locally?
Yeah, it very much depends on the individual capital scheme. They're obviously, as you know, they're all assets that reside in the borough. We do contract in the most economically advantageous way, but also with a slant toward inclusion of suppliers that have got a locality base as well. I'd have to get back to you, Councillor Blacker, in terms of the individual split, which would probably take me some time to calculate with my procurement colleagues, but I wouldn't be comfortable quoting a figure to you at the moment on that. But it's a point well made about the economic benefit of the capital programme and how much of that money is effectively retained locally.
Yeah, and I think, we always hear lots about the Preston model, and obviously we're not Preston, but we do have that significant ability to invest in the local borough, in the borough. Councillor Dubrovska has a question.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to answer
that
question, Chair, just in relation to the highway, footway and carriageway. We do actually have a very local contractor, Murrells, who deliver that work, and so the most significant item on that particular list is delivered by a local contractor, and knowing a lot of those members of staff, they are all very local in terms of actually living in or very close to the borough as well. So it's a great opportunity to spend more locally with them.
Thanks. Joanna.
Thank you. I might have just missed a line of narrative. The FE2 2107, the wheelie bin procurement and the LATCO repurposing. Can I just have the explanation of what happened there and the timing on that? I might have missed a line somewhere.
I think that's a simple. There was originally a capital investment requirement, we thought, from a vehicle purchasing and financing perspective, as we brought the fleet service element of waste services back in house. We've now financed those assets, Councillor Dubrovska, in a different way, using a set of finance leases. We're therefore proposing to repurpose that funding to pay for the for the wheelie bin rollout to therefore increase food waste. So again, we're showing it transparently as an in and an out effectively, but being very clear we're actually repurposing it for, although it's within waste services as a whole, it is for a slightly different purpose.
Okay, so it'll be good to have, if I can just offline, have just more detail behind that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. No other questions on this one, Ross, so let's move on.
Yeah, this is another code requirement, so a little bit like the capital strategy, the treasury management strategy. There's a requirement for a new financial management code about that key term that's used nowadays, which is about sustainable financial management. The first year, as it says there, is 21-22, 12 standards to adopt, and it's up for us to determine whether we meet the standards and how that works going forward. As you'd expect through normal good governance and kind of the principles and practices set out in SIPFA code more generally, as opposed to just this specific financial management code, we do a lot of this by default anyway. Obviously, there's an increased interest, particularly given some of the challenges of boroughs in London and nationwide that have struggled financially in year to balance their books and will also struggle from a future context point of view. So it will be a key requirement in the auditor's value for money assessment as well going forward. But it's introduced new in terms of 21-22 and therefore requires an approval of full council to adopt it formally for next year.
Thanks. Should we move on?
Fees and charges, a very extensive and micro presentation of fees and charges as we have always done at ELIN. There is an appendix, as you will have seen and no doubt read, within the overall budget strategy report. It's Appendix 3 for those of you that have not had a chance to look at that yet, which sets out all the variations of individual fees and charges across the board. There's majoritively an inflation only or a standstill position being applied with one or two exceptions to that. In the majority of instances, those exceptions are based on previous years' future ELIN savings aspirations to move to cost neutrality from a service perspective. So as I say, when you do look through those, it's majoritively a relatively standstill position, if not a zero increase, although again, as ever, in the interest of transparency, there are a few of those that look quite significant, but they relate to previous years' savings proposals that we put on the table.
Thanks. Do you want to finish this bit on fees and charges and then we'll take questions? Sorry, yeah. I didn't realise there was a second part.
Sorry, Councillor Blacker, it's a bit of an extension of what I said effectively. So specifically the festivals and events aligns to that long-term strategy that we've got, and there's a few other ones in there that we've highlighted as well.
Thanks. I think there are 41 pages of this, so we could be here all night. So I'm hoping that Councillors Ball and Rice are focusing on only a few of them each. So John, and then Miriam, and then Ross, if you come back on those questions.
I'm not going to go through 41 individual items, don't worry. So really it's one point, although it does cover a few lines, which is to do with the stuff relating to the film industry. So there's filming permits, there's street closures, there's parking dispensations. I think I may have mentioned this before, but anyway, I think there is scope for banding that based on the budget of the film involved, and potentially charging quite a lot more for big budget films. That's the way the crew rates work nowadays. Is major features and the high-end TV pay a lot more than the lower budget stuff. So I think it would be worthwhile, in collaboration with the film office, talking through what can be done to actually to band that, so that you have a much higher, maybe 40 or 50 pounds a day for a parking suspension for the high budget jobs that will support it, and then you have a kind of a low budget rate that's something similar to the current one, maybe even lower. But you know, there'd be a way to increase the total amount of revenue that you get from the film industry, particularly topical at the moment because Tower Hamlets have recently stopped issuing filming permits because of sort of their residents have been sort of getting concerned that film crews are hanging around in the street when they're not allowed to go out. So it's a competitive market, filming, and as I say, one of the competitors has shut the doors at the moment. So it may be a time when Ealing can increase their prices. I hope not too many people in my industry are watching this on YouTube, but I think there's an opportunity for the council to make to make some money out of the bigger budget jobs that can afford it.
I was wondering whether you might need to declare an interest, John, but you know, I think if you're
it's kind of the reverse.
Well, exactly. Once I realised what you were saying, Miriam, do you want to
inside knowledge? But I think I'm happy to have that considered. I think my understanding actually is the Film Office do take that more sort of nuanced approach. So when we do have larger, big budget films, although clearly none being sort of not many are being sort of made at the moment, I imagine. But yeah, they do take a sort of they do take the negotiation route with them in order to get the most appropriate price and value for Ealing Borough.
Okay. Miriam.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, there's one thing that I've noticed. There's a lot of new fees which refer to the Ealing Learning Partnership, and I just wondered how that was working out. If it was a case of once that's spent, is that each school having to spend it, or is it like a shared expense? Since the Ealing, since the ELP is very much a kind of a shared experience for our schools. And there's one thing that probably does touch a bit on what Councillor Ball has been saying. Just seeing where fees have gone up and trying to understand why. Is there something that we could have done more in order to avoid putting up fees in certain places? Because I mean, one thing that does jump out is that the sex establishment licence, and that hasn't actually gone up at all. But I did actually contrast that. But one thing that I did contrast it with when I was going through, looking at the temporary traffic notice for a filming order, which has gone up. And so to me, I couldn't quite understand why it was a sex establishment licence. I mean, we are talking about something that actually has very low employment impact. And I think it's an industry which I think once lockdown is over, once all this crisis is over, I think they will very quickly build up business again. And I think they will do well. But really looking at the film industry, it really does seem like it's something that, I mean, really has got a lot of us through the lockdown that we've experienced, the fact that we have had TV and films to watch. And that industry has really done so much in order to help give us something to do, give us some hope, give us some entertainment, to really do a lot for mental health. And so I'm just really interested as to why we make those kind of choices that we make, especially when you consider the film industry does actually employ an awful lot of people, and so it's quite important. But I mean, that's just one contrast that I picked out. I mean, I'd just like to understand more about how that's done, please. Thank you.
Ross, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, so many of the ELP charges, the ones that have come in, are kind of a splitting down on a more detailed basis to get a bit more transparency and clarity on what they actually do, and some of them are meant to help reduce the cost of subsidisation of the Ealing Learning Partnership overall, which, as you know, that the council still chooses quite wisely to invest with, and they're done in consultation with Julie Lewis, the director of schools, effectively, who looks very closely at the propensity and the kind of the demand for the services. The sex establishment versus a temporary traffic order, well, I'd have to have a look at the individual requirements. Some of them are statutory, some of them are not, and some of them are done from an inflation-only perspective, whereas some are actually read across to try and influence behaviour. So, Councillor Rice, I'd probably have to get back to you on those more detailed questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, on that one, on the licence for those sorts of establishments, I think we can look at the fee for it. Clearly, our objective as a borough is that we have zero. So multiply any figure by zero, you're still going to get zero, and that would be what I would hope in terms of our income on that particular line, whatever figure is shown on the document. But that's all I'd say on that.
Thanks, Councillor Mahfouz. Any further questions on fees and charges before we move on? Because I know this is always something that people are very interested in. If not, Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I'd only highlight, I guess, that one area where we haven't taken the cost of inflation into account is actually around burials. So that's one set of charges which we have applied no increase in terms of inflationary costs at all. And you'll appreciate at this incredibly sensitive time when families are grieving up and down the borough, it's not, it's something that we haven't changed the cost of.
Thanks, Ross. Let's move on.
Okay. This talks in the great context of the figure we've already seen included at the top half of the balanced budget. It goes into a bit more detail about the specific allocations that were announced from a finance settlement perspective, be it some further funding, 1.9 million from Ealing's share of an overall national distribution in relation to children's and adult social care. We've clearly built that into the budget as a one-off funding stream. We touched earlier in the context of the overall reserves resilience and the general fund balance about the unconditional grant, which was for COVID-19 purposes in 21-22. We've used some of that. We've fed that into the budget to fund some of those growth areas from a next year perspective, but we've also retained a proportion of that. So as we incur new costs in the year, we'll be able to have the certainty of that funding there as a call to fund the associated expenditure. Just to build on Councillor Mahfouz's point, the big headline announcement in the Chancellor's provisional settlement was that there was going to be a core spending power increase across all local authorities. Councillor Mahfouz rightly said that actually the majority of that core spending power was really funded by council tax and social care precept power ability, as opposed to genuinely new grant. And the other interesting dynamic around core spending power and the grant allocations is that in the core spending power, that's the area that you typically look for recurring finance to come through to the local authority. So again, there wasn't a huge amount in terms of recurring income, which is very important for our sustainability point, which I talked about a little bit earlier on. Thereafter, we get back to that point I've touched on already, which I won't rehearse too much, which is about the uncertainty of the one-year settlement. So it was just a single-year settlement that was announced pre-Christmas in that provisional settlement, and just for completeness, the final settlement has literally come through about 3 hours ago, which we've yet to digest, but we're led to believe that that is very, very similar to provisional, as it usually is. And then longer term, it touches down there that both the funding reset and the fair funding review are likely to be delayed. But I think the funding reset is now due in 2023, I think it is. I'm not sure exactly where the fair funding review will be. And obviously we've got the Chancellor's budget on the 3rd of March, which will have an implication, we think, from a business rates perspective and a billing perspective, which I can touch on if people are interested. Next slide, please.
Yeah, move on.
So back to Councillor Shaw's question. Hopefully this provides a bit more detail and transparency exactly on what the different impacts and effects of the increase in the council tax and the increase in the social care precepts are from an Ealing perspective. That's shown on the 4th line down on the top table, where it says Ealing starts at £867.33 and runs up to £2,602 effectively for a band H. Underneath that, just to be clear, we've got the General London Assembly as well, which is a separate line. So that's up to them to determine what the precept is for that area. We don't have any power to influence that. But obviously, as a precepting authority, we have to bill our residents for the totality of all precepts, which is what the bottom line on that first table is. Interesting, one of the reasons why Budget Council's been pushed back to the first week of March is because the GLA are not agreeing their draft budget until the 25th, and obviously we don't want to set a budget without the certainty of what the GLA are agreeing to, because it's that resolution that then goes on to form the council tax bills that we issue to our residents. So that's the actual reason why it's changed. And you'll see there at the bottom, when you take the Ealing increase of 4.99%, those two factors, and you blend that with the GLA, it comes out at an average increase of 5.95%. And back to Councillor Shaw's question, from a Band D equivalent, which is how we calculate our council tax base, that equates to a weekly change, as it says there in the fourth column from the left, of about £1.80 a week on a Band D equivalent.
Thanks. I've got Councillor Ball for now, and I'm sure others will come in. So if John, you ask a question, then I'll take some others as they come in, and then we'll get you to answer, Ross and Baz.
Yeah, it was just on that timing point, because I recall hearing previously that we try to set the council tax as early as possible, because as soon as the bills go out, some people pay the whole year up front, and so there's actually a cash flow assistance from doing that. So has the GLA setting their precept late, has that actually cost us money?
Okay, so we'll take Deirdre and then Councillor Costigan and then Councillor Driscoll, and then Ross, if you answer those, and then we'll move on to any others that come in. So Deirdre first.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Ross, and to officers and to Baz for all the work that's gone into this, because clearly it's a huge undertaking every year, and I know the government kind of coming in so late just before Christmas, always with some of the figures that you need, is very difficult for council finance staff. I had a question about the council tax that then sort of led me on to stuff that you covered earlier, and council tax is a very regressive tax, isn't it? So basically, the poorer you are, the greater proportion of your income you spend on council tax compared to people who live in £1 million mansions, for example. So it's quite a regressive tax. So it struck me, we don't really do any kind of equality impact analysis on how this affects residents, these increases that we're being forced into doing by the government. Like you say, they have assumed that we're going to increase council tax and the social care precept in order to balance the budget. So do we do any kind of equality impact assessment to look at how that affects our residents? That sort of led me on to think the savings that we looked at earlier, at what stage do we equality impact assess them? I assume we do somewhere along the road. When do we look at doing the equality impact assessments and just checking if there's any mitigation that we need to put in place, if there are any particular groups with protected characteristics who may be particularly impacted? Thanks.
Thanks. And then Councillor Driscoll.
Thanks, Josh. I'm just linking this through with the council tax and the council tax support programme, because I think it's a 39% increase in working people claiming assistance and 10% increase in those with children claiming assistance, because we used to have a symbiotic relationship with housing benefit, and our administration costs were assisted centrally, central government grant. So that substantial increase in claimants and is likely to go on. Have we got contingency for the administration costs from that? How is that planned in? I know we've got a general contingency plan, but just to clarify how that is going to be understood and funded, and are we prepared for that probably increasing demand for this type of support for council tax? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Ross, Baz, cash flow on setting council tax early, and then the two equality impact assessment points and the impact of the demand on our support schemes.
Yeah, thanks. I'll kick off and let Councillor Mahfouz come in as he sees fit. So it's fairly unusual that we have too many residents willing to pay their entirety of their council tax in advance of the commencement of the year in which it's due. We do have, thankfully, quite a strong cash flow position as an authority overall. There's actually been many other, included London authorities, that have struggled from a cash flow perspective. So the delay to issuing the bill is unhelpful, but we still think we'll do that in such a way that the direct debits will be taken, and those people that are willing to pay early will continue to do so as they have in previous years. So I don't expect any material negative impact from our perspective. Councillor Costigan, I would agree wholeheartedly that there is council tax is very regressive as a tax overall. We are looking at undertaking the equalities impact assessment in terms of the changes. We've not done that previously, if I'm being honest. It's something that's quite hard for us to estimate credibly. We do always look to the fact that we've got a progressive and extensive council tax reduction scheme, which is very much meant to protect those low income families, even those earnings that are still in receipt of benefit. And you'll recall from the bandings that we have in that way that we think that does provide a level of protection. But of course, you're quite right to point out there will still be some adverse impacts for families within the borough. In terms of the individual savings, pre-implementation, there is a requirement for an EIA to be undertaken before we go ahead with that. And that's the responsibility of either the exec director or the director responsible for implementing that. So that's kind of done pre-implementation at that point. And then Councillor Driscoll, the CTR claimant numbers, I think it's reasonable to expect them to continue to rise. We have received some individual one-off support from a 21-22 perspective in the form of a council tax hardship grant, which we will use in the first instance to deal with that increase in caseload that we're experiencing. And we have around £3 million of grant to do that from a 21-22 perspective. Now, clearly that takes us so far down the line, but won't cover the entirety of the cost if we continue to see the rise that we've seen already in working age claimants. And therefore, effectively, that increase over and above any grant is actually something that the council funds by default, because the impact of CTR is to reduce the council tax base for the council, which is one of our key funding sources. So up to a point, we have financial coverage on that, up to the value of about £3 million as a one-off in 21-22. Anything over and above that would first manifest itself technically in a collection fund hit in year, which would then result in a pressure in the following financial year. Apologies if that's a little bit complex, but that's kind of how it maps out from an impact perspective.
Thanks, Ross. And I
Chair, just very, very quickly, but I guess just on that point that Councillor Ball made, realistically, we're looking to send everything to a printer in terms of sort of the weekend after full council. So really, no real delay in terms of having to move that meeting back by a week. The bigger challenge actually is around business rates, and business owners up and down the borough are really concerned that at the moment they've got, a lot of them have that business rate relief for this financial year, but they have no idea what's happening for next financial year, and whether this government, the UK government, is going to follow in the footsteps, as it has so often throughout this pandemic, the footsteps of the Scottish government, and decide to perhaps at the last minute issue a 3-month relief of business rates, or whether they go further or don't do anything at all. But sadly, it's probably linked to the budget, which will be almost the same time that we are making decision-making process that we'll be taking as well. And so that will be leaving it incredibly late for us to make any of the changes that are necessary around our business rate notices that we need to send out. And if there is a change, we may have to spend money and time rectifying that, and obviously getting that through all on the system as well. I mean, having checked through the newspapers only this week, there's talk of getting rid of council tax altogether and introducing something else completely. So if that gets announced at the start of March, I don't know what we'll do, but we'll see. Yeah.
Thanks. Councillor Costigan, I think you have a follow-up.
Yeah, it was just quickly, Chair, just in terms of the equality impact assessments, I know officers have said that they're done prior to implementation, so actually after we make the decision. But if it's found that there is, too much of an impact on particular protected characteristics, groups with protected characteristics, at that point, do we have like kind of backup plans if some of the savings can't be taken forward? Thanks.
Yeah, so if it were found that having undertaken the EIA that the protected characteristics impact were to be so adverse that it was to disadvantage them unfairly, we would look to substitute that saving with an alternative, and that would have to come back through a form of approval depending upon how high the individual value of that saving was. So obviously we've got delegations to amend within certain limits from an office perspective, but if it was a material saving, i.e. over £500,000, we'd bring that back as a substitute in front of members to replace it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Ross. Should we move on?
Yeah. This goes on to talk about the bit that we've covered off in quite a bit of detail already, which is the extension of the council tax reduction scheme. It also touches on the council tax exemption for care leavers, which is providing the full relief for care leavers up to the age of 25, with those caveats about birthday that Councillor Mafu says, and that's obviously where the care leaver theirself is liable for council tax, and obviously that doesn't affect all the other appropriate and relevant benefits that individuals may be entitled to as well. And then just for completeness, we're also introducing, as we are now allowed to do, an additional empty property premium of 300% where a property has been empty for over 10 years. And I don't have to hand exactly how many properties that we have on record that applies to, but I think it's important that we introduce any measure that we can to free up housing provision within the borough.
Thanks. And I think we covered the care leavers point earlier, but Councillor Rooney, feel free if you wanted to come back and ask anything else on that, or indeed anyone else.
Thank you, Chair. I think everything was covered earlier, but thank you.
Great, thanks. So Ross, shall we move on?
Yeah, next slide, please, Siobhan. This just talks about the business rates and the collection fund, and starts to try and unpack some of the latest moves on that. It's clear that obviously we've been in the London business rates pool for a couple of years now, albeit in a pilot form. It's clear that with the potential losses from a business rates perspective, there's a number of authorities that have not been keen to continue that, and that's basically because although when times are good from an economic perspective and financially, we get to share in the uptake of overall business rates collection, which is strongly led by the central London boroughs. Clearly, when times are bad, we also are exposed to the risk of those losses as well. And there's a number of authorities that have quite sensibly said that they don't want to have to burden that kind of share of the pressure that might manifest itself. There's a whole set of complex formulas that sit around this that have to be looked at on an individual basis, but needless to say, we'll be coming out of the pool and reverting back to the position that we had pre-pool. All of those things are taken account of in the budget projections that you've already seen today in terms of the budget gap and the MTFS overall. And then secondly, the collection fund position is in a small surplus to the tune of £518,000 from a 2021 perspective, but you'll see there that's really a tale of two halves, which is a good position council tax and a more challenging position business rates wise. That is going to become a very significant issue for the authority going forward. As you know, that as I said earlier, we've taken some very significant reductions both on council tax and business rates in year, even outside of those grants and reliefs being offered. and the government had introduced a mechanism to spread and compensate those back to us. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's a huge difference between the two compensation schemes that it's designed. The business rates ones, interestingly, is slightly more generous and actually leaves us in an okay position, whereas the council tax one, I think, will leave us quite significantly exposed to these losses that we've been incurring each year. So we will cover that off in more detail in future reports. It's not so much an issue at all for 21-22, but certainly will become an issue in 22-23 and future years.
Thanks. I'm not seeing anyone who's put their hand up so far. I think the only question from my point of view, we're obviously extending the current scheme on the living wage discount scheme, which fully support. But do we know how many employers that has brought on board to pay living wage that otherwise wouldn't have done in the last few years? Like, what's the target for the number of businesses that sign up in the next year?
Unless you're buying
Go on. I was going to say, I mean, I've spoken with Nick Grove, who's not with us this evening, but leads on that side of things. And effectively, so what I'd spoken to him at length last year was to actually get a letter out from myself to all of those businesses, not only just about London Living Wage, but also about apprenticeship opportunities as well, and tapping into some of the levy that we're paying as an authority, see if we could support them with that. The challenge, of course, is that with so many of those businesses getting 100% rate relief anyway, there is no incentive for us to be able to offer clearly, and who we don't know what the situation looks like, of course, for next financial year, and probably won't know for a while. So it becomes a challenge if the carrot effectively disappears anyway. But I think we'll continue to, certainly on the apprenticeships and trying to get back into quality work placements as well. That's it's certainly a key driver that I'll continue to try and push.
Thanks. Ross, should we move on?
Yeah. And this is just for completeness, really. This is the school's budget overall from a DSG perspective. As it says there, this goes through the school's forum meeting, which has already taken place in January of this year. As it says there, there's some additional funding that's been allocated from a central government allocation point of view, circa £10 million in total. And just again for transparency, we are now running a DSG deficit, and therefore there is a recovery strategy in place to bring that back in balance over the course of the next couple of years. So again, I won't dwell on that. These are set out in quite a lot of detail in the report itself and available to read at your leisure.
And that is the last slide, in fact, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm surprised there were no questions on the parking account, but I'm sure that is something OSC will return to as we go through. I've now lost my box with the participants on. There we go. So thanks, Ross and Baz and Shabana, and obviously all the colleagues who put that together. It's a huge amount of work that goes into that budget setting process. I know that's not the last few weeks' work. That's the last few months, and given the coronavirus crisis started almost a year ago now, you've been dealing with a lot, so thank you for that. If there are questions on the generality of the budget, anything that's not been covered in that, please do. I saw Councillor Ball's hand went up and has come down again, so I don't know if there was something you wanted to ask, but please do. We've got the officers here now. We've got Councillor Mafouz here, so I've got John's up and down again.
Oh no, so I thought you called me now, so I didn't need it anymore. Yeah, but yeah, no, that's right. So what it was the parking fund, but then I thought you'd sort of decided no one was going to put the hand up quick enough. So
I will always let you talk about the parking fund.
I mean, it's just, I suppose not. Yeah, I mean, sort of. So how much are we expecting to receive into the parking fund from the FPN income from associated with the LTNs in the next financial year?
I've got a couple of other questions, if you don't mind just holding on so we can get through them. Councillor Woodruff and then Councillor Crawford. Simon.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether the officer on council tax, whether the officers have now got a handle on what other boroughs, particularly local ones, are doing. I imagine most of them are going for the Quota top rates, really. But I was wondering if the officers have sort of heard about local boroughs in London, particularly.
Thanks. And Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Really, for Councillor Foos, just about in general terms, given the financial difficulties that everyone is going through at the moment, how confident are we that these savings that we're putting forward are robust and they're the right financial decisions for the local authority? Thank you.
Thanks. So I don't know, Ross, if you want to take the LTNs and the council tax, and then Baz, obviously the point of view of the feasibility and.
Yeah, on the LTNs, it's a relatively trivial amount in the context of the overall £22 million parking account, and I think broadly covers off the associated costs of actually having those in place. Again, I can provide a more detailed figure. I can perhaps do that through the Liberal Democrat briefing at the appropriate point as well, Councillor Ball. So leave that with me, but it's certainly not a material figure by any sense of the word, and particularly not in the context of the parking account itself. Councillor Woodruff's question about comparators. Last time we did a survey amongst treasurers, I think there was over 75%, if not 80%, that were looking to take the maximum permissible increases, and that applied to the majority of the neighbouring boroughs to Ealing. Clearly, a bit of that's contextualised in the fact that there are very few income sources that we can look to rely on, if that's the right sense of the word, from a council tax dependency, that actually present themselves as a recurring income source. So the majority of officers will be recommending that. And on last count, as I say, it was about 75–80%. And of those others, just to be clear, that they were kind of pitching themselves at the 4% plus territory, so that there was no one that was a material outlier compared to where the majority find themselves. And the Councillor Crawford question on robustness of savings, do you want me to take that? Or is that
I think it was more of a political question, Ross, but I think, I think as I covered off in the key messages at the start, and thank you, Daniel, for your questions, is in terms of, I think the key things here is that the proposals that we've put forward are all what we would call our sort of future Ealing programme type savings. So they are ones that, going back to that really important principle that we have as part of future Ealing, and actually was reiterated in our engagement sessions when we hold them time and time again throughout December, that we need to prioritise and protect our most vulnerable. Having a list of proposals which doesn't impact negatively on our most vulnerable residents is incredibly important. And I think, if we didn't have, with that, the council tax increase, for example, let's say that we didn't take that as the government expects us to, we'd have to find a further £7.2 million. So when we talk about regressiveness, when we talk about the impact on the most vulnerable, if we had to find a further £7.2 million worth of savings within our services, we've been really, really just dragged down to the bones of what we're providing as a service, and councils up and down the country have really had this after 10 years of unrelenting austerity, that 64p in the pound disappearing. And what that means is that really that would have been absolutely horrific had we had to implement that as a set of savings rather than the council tax increase. So that's why I'm confident this evening that I can say, look, I would rather take that as the government is expecting us to, and that we counterbalance that in the best way possible with our very progressive and supportive council tax reduction scheme, which, with council approval, will be extending to those care leavers as well.
Thanks, Baz. I don't think, unless Councillor Woodruff, that's wanting to come back on a follow-up, I don't think there is anyone else on the budget. Shabana, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think earlier there was a question around the greener Ealing growth.
Just to confirm, the growth was agreed by Cabinet in the report in October 2019, which kind of lays out what Ross had kind of mentioned earlier, and paragraph 11, if somebody wants to know the exact paragraph.
Thanks, Shabana.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think that was Councillor Shaw, whose internet has disconnected him. So he may not actually have heard that answer, but I will tell him to rewatch it on YouTube once he's.
We don't have to tell him the exact moment, which minute on the playback to find it, or we could just let him play back the whole thing.
I'm sure he'll want to listen to the whole thing again. So I think if that's it, I mean, again, I think, you know, the committee kind of reiterates the thanks to obviously Councillor Mahfouz and Ross and your officers for putting that budget together. It is an incredibly challenging time, as I think has been outlined. And, you know, after 10 years of austerity, some of these savings are going to be incredibly difficult to achieve. But I think we've done an excellent job putting that together. And obviously it goes to Cabinet on Tuesday. And then full council once we get the Mayor's decision on the precept. So thank you very much to Baz, Ross and Shabana. I think we can, no, I don't think there's any suggestions of recommendations other than to note that and to kind of, we will come back to it at full council, all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brings us to our next item 7, which is the OSC work programme, and we do, Sam, have, if I can find the correct link, sorry, I'm flipping between tabs, update on recommendations.
Yes, Chair, that's right. You may remember you saw this document back in December, but we had a very long meeting in December and decided to defer this element of it to a later meeting. So it's here with you tonight, members. So, you know, any comments on the updated recommendations would be welcome. It's up to you whether you want to continue to receive these ones or whether you feel the actions are closed. And then additionally, within this item, within the work programme item, you've got the items for the remaining municipal year, and also I'm asking for, you know, just to put it on your radar, it's that time of the year again where we're looking for topics for next year. So it all comes around very quickly, especially when we've had a compressed year like we have this year with sort of COVID disrupting things. But you know, we are looking for topics for next year. We've already put the advert out in Ealing News Extra, and sort of asking the public through the normal channels. So, you know, welcome to suggestions during this meeting or afterwards, or through any other channels really, for looking for items for topics for next year. So if anyone has any questions, comments on those 3 key things that we need to consider in this this report, then please send them my way via the chair. Thank you.
Thanks. I think on the 18-19 recommendations, the world has changed somewhat on a lot of them. So I think we can probably not take them again. I mean, housing and planning, obviously, we are reviewing the local plan. Scroll down to the next one, and there were 26 on that one. And others, you know, the world has moved on somewhat since then. So I think we can probably not take them. So if there are any final comments on those, there are a lot of green cells in there. So I think most of these are in train then. So unless there are any comments, we can probably move on to the wider picture. Sorry, I had lost my participant tab. So I do have Councillors Rice, Driscoll and Woodruff. I do apologise that it had been hidden behind the report I was reading. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, because I was just talking about the suggestions for next year. I mean, I don't know if that's the right point to discuss this now. Right, so because one thing that's coming to my mind is HS2. Now, I understand that there was a transport scrutiny panel before my time, which wasn't all that long ago, but I'm just thinking if that might be an interesting one to look at, because it's actually having a huge impact on residents across the borough. And that could also bring in, we'd have to go back to Crossrail at some point anyway, because the Crossrail situation is really, we had them at the meeting here, and I mean, it's really felt like they we could put our faith in them at last. We could put trust in these new people, but then things didn't seem to go particularly well after that. And so I think really maybe it's somehow need to bring transport back into that if we can, unless there'd be like a wider committee which encompasses transport in some way and encompasses what's going on with the new train lines. But it'd be just really, really good to actually have a proper look at that, because I think the residents would really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks.
Councillor Driscoll.
Thanks, Josh. And is it the right time to just raise up one of the recommendations from the previous panel?
Yes.
Yeah, it's recommendation 8 on page 53 of 76, and it's to do with idling, because regulations have changed nationally, and part of the issue was the penalty was so low that it was more costly to enforce it than to enforce, so actually the penalty has increased to either 60 or 80 pounds now. So things have changed nationally, which I think we need to push back and say, actually, the landscape has changed. And I think we should be moving to do what a lot of our other neighbouring boroughs are doing, is to enforce that idling when it happens with the most appropriate level of fine now is higher, to actually covers its cost of actually issuing it, which sounds sensible. So the landscape has changed, and I think that needs to go back to officers to say, have another look at this.
That's great. Thanks for that. It's a really useful one. I know Councillor Rooney has had a lot of correspondence about the Acton Central level crossing on precisely that. So I think, Sam, even if we drop the rest, if we can follow that one up with regulatory for an update, that would be really helpful.
Thank you.
Councillor Woodruff, I think, was next.
Yeah, just about the panel 2 on knife crime. I had a few, Councillor Raza chaired it. She sent me 1 or 2 comments about it. I mean, I could either read them out or forward the email on to you. I don't know which way you want to do it.
How many comments are we talking about, Councillor Woodruff?
Let's have a look. Well, about 4 or 5, really.
Okay. Maybe if you read them out for the record, and then I can go out and get some responses for you.
Yeah, recommendation 4: Inspector Robinson has left, and the Your Life You Choose programme is being delivered by Sergeant Benjamin and Imogen Hurst, currently online. Recommendation 7: Councillor Raza attended the First West Area Youth Independent Advisory Group yesterday to better understand young people's concerns, particularly with added challenges of lockdowns during the pandemic, to build up trust and understanding with the police and community. Recommendations 10 and 11, a meeting organised next month around recruitment opportunities for young people to encourage more local and representative officers, and around stop and search in particular. Recommendation 13, young people are increasingly disadvantaged in their future and opportunities with a triple hit from austerity, Brexit, and now COVID pandemic. More important than ever to have youth provision and engagement at the heart of everything the council does. And then recommendation 19, in recent meetings with young people online, most expressed that they did not feel supported with their mental health, particularly with remote online teaching. There must be better access to online mental health support from our schools. Antisocial behaviours around gathering in our green spaces and party cars driving around with a plentiful supply of drugs and alcohol have been issues during lockdown, but generally not as extensive as they could be. Few instances of stabbings locally. Okay, so that's the email she sent me.
Thank you very much, Councillor Woodruff. And
I can forward that on to you if you.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Councillor Ball.
Yeah, I'm sort of partially agreeing with Councillor Rice earlier on, sometime earlier. I'm not sure there's enough in HS2 alone to be a whole panel, but I think what Councillor Rice said later on in terms of wider transport, when I think it is time to do another transport panel, because there's HS2, there's Crossrail, there's still lagging behind, and other issues. I think it would be worthwhile doing a transport panel. Yeah.
Thanks. We can add it to the MISC. And Councillor Dabrowska.
Thank you. Just on the back of Councillor Ball's and Councillor Rice's comments about transport, I was vice chair of that scrutiny panel for the 2 years. Well, originally it was 1 year, and then I actually requested an expansion because there were so many aspects of it, you know, not just daytime, but there's also the evening transport requirement. But we also looked at air quality. Now, with the climate emergency and it's a hot topic at the moment, and I totally agree. I think we should, I suppose, look as it evolves every few years. So I agree with that.
Thanks. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. So just in terms of ideas for future panels, I thought it might be good to look at homelessness prevention, particularly during the pandemic, and the council's response to that, and like homelessness in the borough. And also another idea was the council's response to domestic violence during the pandemic, which has increased all over the world. And so what the council is doing about that, what services are available for residents as well. So they're just a couple of suggestions for next year.
Thanks. I don't know if Councillor Costigan might be able to pick some of those up in the COVID response panel. Welcome back to Councillor Shaw, who has rejoined us, I think. And I think, Sam, you wanted to come back on the transport panel.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, so as Councillor Ball suggested, I think the specific points about HS2 and Crossrail, there's probably not enough in those two combined to have a whole panel for the year. But even if not, I think you're right, Councillor Rice, they are very important topics to residents. So there may, even if we're not able to do a panel, it may be something we can get on the agenda for OSC as a distinct topic for OSC. Perhaps get some witnesses in from, the different organisations and have a good discussion and scrutinise it that way. I think that might be the better approach, but if we are able to think of a larger transport panel that can bring that within scope, that could also be another way of doing it.
Thanks. We certainly had Crossrail come to us, I think, as Miriam said, sometime. It was in Percival House, so it must have been a very long time ago now. Simon, did you want to come back on something?
No, I must get used to this eventually.
Well, let's not get too used to it, because then we'll not want to go back to the meetings. But thanks very much, everyone, for those suggestions. I think we will have to kind of scope out what we can and can't cover as panels and what we might bring to OSC. And I think if I go to our current work programme, we have the budget. The next meeting is obviously call-in only. We have the Crime and Disorder Committee the next time we regularly meet, which is our statutory meeting, and then we return to the item that we have talked for some time about, from Councillor Taylor's suggestion when he subbed on. Again, it was when we were in a physical meeting, workplace equality, so looking at the diversity of the council's workforce. There's been an internal report that we can look at separate to the work that is going on with the Race Equality Commission, looking at broader things in the borough. We can certainly add then transport in some way, shape or form to that agenda, the ongoing agenda, beyond perhaps July as well, where we have, I think we said that we wanted to look at Broadway living, greenery living and so on, the way in which those operate and are accountable to us as councillors. Is there anything else on that work programme? And again, I've lost the list of attendees. Councillor Costigan.
Sorry, I'm coming back on the transport issue, Chair. It's just to say, if we are going to include transport on the agenda somewhere along the way, can we include buses? Because I think for a lot of our local residents in Northolt, they rely on buses more than the trains or the tube. And during COVID in particular, there's been a huge fall off in people using train and tube. But the buses pass me all the time and they're still packed with lots of our local residents who are low paid going to work on the bus. So can we just make sure we don't forget the buses? Thanks.
Thanks. And obviously what we normally do at this point is run through issues from the panels. And I'm aware that we probably haven't heard that update for a while, especially Councillor Crawford from you. We've not heard from Health for a little while, and we've talked about the work that Councillor Costa has done on COVID and so on. Dan, was there anything you wanted to update us on in terms of Health? Because I know JOSC I saw a notice for JOSC. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to update us on that we should be aware of.
I mean, I don't know really. The things that I would summarise are probably things that everybody already knows. So the JOSC meeting was principally to talk about the rollout of the vaccine and how they were going to manage that. And actually, it's gone a lot better than they had envisaged in terms of the number of people who are taking it up. We have a meeting next week, a health meeting, a panel meeting, oral presentations from the NHS and from Kerry Stevens around the continuing support that's being offered to vulnerable residents, the rollout of the vaccine, and then what Ealing's health services will look like going forward, depending on how long the pandemic goes. But I think really the message from the health panel is we are continuing to monitor people's experience and putting those questions as best we can to both the CCG, the NHS, and then the wider health authorities. But there's nothing that isn't revelatory information, because I think one of the things we've done, certainly for councillors, is councillors are well informed of the decisions that are being taken by the council and by our public health colleagues.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. I don't know if other chairs of panels wanted to update anything at this point. It would be neat to not end at 9 o'clock or thereabouts. So please do say something if you need to. No. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think that does bring us to the end of the agenda. I don't think, Sam, unless you wave at me with anything urgent, that we've missed anything we need to do this evening. So as I said, we do have a call-in only meeting on the 4th of March. And if not, I will see you at the other end of March for our statutory crime and disorder panel. So thank you very much, everyone. And